So welcome everyone to the latest podcast for Growth Ripples. And it's my pleasure today to be joined by the perennial expert here, John Carvin. He's a bit of a master of industry, if you like. And I've worked with John for a little while, and we go back sometime really around our mediation experience. So today we're going to explore the topic of conflict resolution, hopefully with some key learnings that we can share from our careers helping people with conflict. So John, maybe for those that of our guests that don't know you, if you could just give a quick spiel as to who you are and what you're about.
Absolutely, yeah. So look, very quickly, background as an ex-lawyer. I've had my own business as well. I've worked in recruitment and I worked for a bank for about 6-7 years as well, and then obviously became an accredited mediator as well. But, you know, really what I'm about is, let's say early intervention, resolving conflict and getting in early, and if need be, then doing things like mediation as well. And ultimately that comes back to problem solving. You know, there are a lot of things which I think can be dealt with earlier on, but it comes back to actually, you know, finding best ways that we can actually deal with problems, and everybody gets, I hate to use the cliche, a win-win situation out of it, a compromise.
Yeah.
So
Great. Excellent. Yeah, I was really looking forward to this chat, John, because, you know, for a lot of people that, you know, reaching out to both you and myself, you know, conflict is playing in a lot of workplaces, particularly as we've seen it, you know, off the back of COVID and work from home. We saw the scenario, I know both of us, where sort of people were kind of going, oh, great, I no longer have to work with Bob or John down the road, or, you know, across from my petition. Now I'm at home, I can just sort of get on with things. But then suddenly, you know, 18 months, 2 years, never being in the workplace, I haven't actually dealt with that conflict.
yeah, and you're right. I think there's a lot of unresolved issues which have been sitting there, and it's almost been now people are looking to go back to the workforce or into their work offices, I guess, or companies requiring them to do so. And some people are saying no, and it's not because they don't want to go in. There's underlying potential issues there as well. And we know this is not just about going back into work. It's also going into different work environments. So, for example, teachers, which, you know, we can talk about later as well, or educators, I should say, as well, kind of going back in and dealing with multiple different things they haven't had to deal with for a few years as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I'm sure we can share later on about some of the pro bono work we've been doing with some of the schools and the educators. I guess where I'd be keen to start, John, I mean, you know, you're a recovering lawyer, as you mentioned at the beginning. You know, in terms of some of the useful kind of practical principles, what is it that you see, you know, maybe even learning since moving on from the profession of practicing law, like when you're dealing with conflict, what are the things that you look out for in the first instance?
Yeah, I think, you know, people are people, and this is all about, you know, people talking to each other and dealing with each other, let's say. And it's just as much about you as the other party you're dealing with as well. So when you look at conflict, you've really got to stop, particularly when you're kind of going down the path of conflict, and sit there and think what's actually important to you. So you've got to weigh up, you know, the relationship, and it could be any type of relationship at work. What's the most important thing here? What's your priority? Is it a relationship itself, or do you just feel like you want to get your own way? And you know, I've seen that play out. Not only, well, I guess actually as individuals. I was involved in mediation back in the UK, and that was between a not-for-profit and a local council, and the councils are quite big there. And really, they both wanted their own way. There was an issue around a particular building they had sitting there. And I guess it was all about getting them to sit back and think about what's the most important thing here. You know, it was a large building. It provided a community service. That really is what it was about. And there was underlying tensions in terms of their communication. And that's what we had to work through. You know, so again, prioritise first and then work out what's the best way to get some type of resolution. And in fact, if I go back to the basics, this not-for-profit felt like they'd never been heard by the council in the first place. Asking questions to elicit what the underlying issues were. It had nothing to do with the building. It just went back to the basics of the relationship.
So, John, yeah, I think there's some great principles that you just touched on there. I mean, from my experience, that first one that I think I just want to reiterate or come back to, kind of that difference between focusing on being right or prioritizing the relationship. So you probably know as well, being, both being married men that we are, like sometimes we need to prioritize the relationship over being right. And sometimes maybe your wife would argue that you're never right, John, but, regardless of whether you're right or wrong, sometimes we need to let that go. And if we want to resolve a conflict, it's less about who's right or wrong, and it's about how can we appreciate each other's perspectives.
I just have to teach that to my two daughters as well.
Okay. Yeah. You're definitely outnumbered there, John. Yeah. And then the other piece that you touched on there that I'm really keen to kind of revisit is about making sure people feel heard. So, you talked about the non-for-profit, and they never actually felt that they were heard. And I think that's how powerful it can be for us as, conflict resolvers, if you like, or mediators in different capacities, where people often have not been heard for maybe even their whole lifetime, but particularly for a particular conflict.
Yeah, that's right. And look, it was very much trying to get one party to understand the other party's perspective. So it was asking kind of open-ended questions that would make, in this instance, the council, the borough as they're called in the UK, to really sit back and think about, what position is the not-for-profit in? What are they actually trying to achieve out of this? And what are the underlying interests? And what's the, I guess that they can then take away that will help them resolve this matter quicker. Bearing in mind as well that in this instance, they have to think what are the larger consequences if they can't resolve it as well. So there's a number of different things they need to go through, and that includes things like time and money and a general breakdown, as we said, the priority in terms of a general breakdown of a relationship as well. Look, certainly in this instance, they came to a resolution because it was a matter of finding a solution that would work for both parties. And that solution really went back to something very simple, and that was organising meetings on a weekly basis, an agreed agenda, an agreed update in terms of where things are at, an agreed use of shared contractors to look after the particular building that was an issue. And then they'd have a certain part of that agenda, but they could look at other items as well that impacted in terms of their relationship. But it took a while to get to that. Interesting. It sounds simple, but not always as well.
It's amazing, isn't it? And I guess when I reflect on that, around often it's the simple solutions, but I find that when you're in kind of the eye of the storm of a conflict, it can be very hard kind of to identify that for yourself. And that's the benefit of having someone external where, you probably know it yourself. And I know, sometimes you speak to your brother-in-law or your friend or your cousin or whatever, and you can see a conflict happening and playing out, and you can kind of know what's going on because you're that little bit removed. And so helping guide people to have that conversation and make sure that they feel heard. And again, like that was a very simple solution around a regular agenda, a regular meeting. But I imagine coming back to your second point before, John, that you were helping them both feel heard, and therefore the outcome was likely to be some sort of resolution to whatever their conflict was.
That's right. Absolutely. Yeah. And that this takes place. I mean, that was a specific example. There are so many different examples. People going back to the workplace, as we talked about before, where there's an underlying issue because 2 years ago, someone was quite aggressive or had unruly behaviour towards another individual. And that was the problem. Again, it wasn't going back to work. It was a mediation that occurred recently, where, it was actually, I say 2 years ago, it was 3 years ago, COVID years, I guess 2 years, which is 3 years these days. And that was, again, a very simple issue, where the particular employee didn't want to or didn't know how to deal with conflict. And through the process of mediation, felt like they're in a safe environment where they could actually talk about what actually the real underlying issue was. And it was nothing to do with them coming back to work. They certainly didn't want to deal with this person that they had a run-in with effectively a couple of years ago.
Yeah, okay. I mean, that makes complete sense. I mean, the other thing I was keen to touch on that I think might be useful for those listening and watching at home is that, often I find with conflict, you might have initial expressed positions, and particularly in legal terms, I have this right that I want to exercise. But actually, in terms of resolving a conflict, and it comes back to making sure people feel heard, often our roles as resolvers of conflict or mediators is to actually get underneath that and understand what is the interest of the two parties. And sometimes it's completely unrelated to the position. And I'll give you an example. Like I was working just the other day with a client, and they were having two employees. One was much more senior, the other one only been there for about 18 months. And there was a lot of conflict between the two. And when it came down to the crunch, one individual, the more junior person, wanted to receive an apology from the more senior person. Now, the interesting thing there was, and it almost undid the whole resolution, was the more senior person wasn't willing to give an apology. And the reason being was that, they felt that would somehow imply some sort of guilt or some sort of wrongdoing. Right. Now, the bit where I guess, I came in and where I was trying to resolve the conflict was to say, okay, well, regardless of what the other person wants or is willing to do, what are you willing to live with? And it turned out that person still very much wanted to work there. They still very much wanted to be part of that organization. And so then I had to work, and this is where sometimes I guess you and I, John, we have to have conversations with the two parties one-on-one to then get a resolution between the two people. Do you find that as well in your mediation work?
Absolutely. And it very much comes back to what do you really want? What are you really after? And asking those kind of questions. And often you're right. And through that process of mediation, you can have a joint discussion, but sometimes when you have an individual discussion, you certainly get a much better understanding of what the people are by, again, asking those very simple questions. Yeah. I was trying to think of, I guess, we're involved in a number of franchise matters. And certainly in those franchise matters, there was an issue around revenue share. So there was a lot of conflict that was brought up between the franchisor and the franchisee, and it's a contentious relation anyway. When you actually sat down and talked to the franchisee who had kind of brought up the initial conflict and were refusing to agree with the terms of what the franchisor wanted to do, it actually went back to, there'd been a number of different communications over the years which had come from the franchisor in a very authoritative manner. So it was more as simple as, the tone of the communication itself wasn't something that was appreciated, and it appeared as though there was a lack of respect by the franchisor towards the franchisee in terms of the communication, and sometimes there was no communication. It was just a change that nobody knew about as well. So I literally had a list of 20 different things that were the problems. So the first thing was trying to understand, right, these are the issues. Now, the franchisor just wasn't aware because no one had ever discussed any of this kind of stuff. And the franchisee just wanted better communication. That was it.
It's amazing, isn't it? Like, John, as you're talking there, like, I'm just reflecting on pretty much all the conflicts I've been a part of. And I don't think I can think of one where communication hasn't been a core kind of cornerstone. And I think communication is this thing that sometimes we talk about as though it's objective, but really, I mean, it's subjective. So what is high levels of communication to you might be very different to me, and vice versa. And so often, in that seeking to understand and trying to put to the side who's right or wrong, and just this is a perspective, it's not right or wrong, this is this person's and this is the other person's, and where are we willing to give and take a little bit in order to get some sort of resolution. So that might be, to use your corny phrase, win-win, or it might be a bit of a compromise, or it might be, I'll just do exactly what you ask.
And often the communication sometimes, and again in this instance when I think about the franchisor, part of the communications, they didn't really I guess going back to your point, they didn't customise it towards the franchisees. So it sounded like a dictate, you need to do this, and the communications came out. Often it was a regulatory issue that was outside of the franchisor's control. The franchisor had never actually said, this is not our decision, this is the regulatory body's decision. And as a franchisee, you have to actually comply with that. And it might cost you a certain amount of dollars, or it might impact you in a certain way. But again, that was something that, I guess was talked through. And then there was an agreement, I remember, in terms of the communication. The communication simply had to have a why we're doing this. So every communication that went out to the franchisee started with a why. What needed to be done, why it needed to be done. And that was something, again, that was very simple, but that certainly helped resolve an issue across a large franchise network as well.
Yeah, and I think that why is a great one, because I think so often, and I'm guilty of this, and probably you too are, I imagine, John, time to time. We assume the why is implied, or it's, we assume that it's known.
Yeah.
by making it explicit, we reduce any risk of it being misinterpreted or misunderstood. And particularly when people have potentially conflicting interests like franchisees and franchisors, I imagine that's really powerful to start with a why. As with most communication, as we know from Simon Sinek and various other TED Talks. Is that your sort of, experience
absolutely.
as well?
But the interesting thing about it is that took about 3 hours to get to that. So when we really sat down and went through, again, what are the issues from both sides? What do they think the issues are, and how will they perceive the other party and what they're thinking and what they'd like out of it if they put themselves in the shoes of the other party? We then sat there and kind of had to generate, well, okay, we now understand what both sides are thinking, and we can appreciate what the other sides are thinking. And generally as a franchise or franchisee relationship, they don't want problems. They want to have a relationship. It's their livelihood, in fact, for both parties.
Yeah.
So, they agree.
Sorry, I was just going to say, sorry to interrupt you, John, just about the 3 hours. I mean, I think that's an interesting one because, I guess for those who are watching or listening, if they've never been part of conflict resolution or mediation, it's not necessarily that every conflict will take 3 hours to resolve. But I imagine, and correct me if I'm wrong, John, but that particular one, because there'd been issues ongoing and no one had been talking, if there's something that's been building up for a long period of time, generally it's going to take longer to get the trust back and to get the communication back on track. Is that fair to say?
And I think trust is a key word. There was a breakdown of trust, and it was trying to understand first off, was there that word trust, was there trust there in the first place? So you really, with mediation, with any type of conflict, in fact, you really have to go back to the very beginning and try and work out what is the underlying issue. And I know we're probably being a bit repetitive, but it's just the reality of it. And then you have to work through, all right, we know, and this is part of the process of mediation or conflict. Once we work out what's the underlying issues, then we can get it all out on the table, and then we can start working out what's the solution. And the good thing about conflict, or a good thing about mediation services, is that it's about empowering those parties to come up with their own solution. So it's not you or I sitting there providing a solution. It's certainly for them to provide that solution that they can then carry forward with. And there's a much better chance of success moving forward if they can actually agree on their own solution, not your or my solution as well. Not a third party coming in like a judge.
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, if you ultimately come up with the solution, you're much more likely to buy into it. It just makes logical sense. And, we know from psychology and influencing. So I think, we're kind of coming up to time now, John. So maybe if I can just quickly recap, I think we've touched on some really great principles and hopefully some practical tips for people to take away. So first up, think about, do you want to focus on being right, or do you want to focus on maintaining the relationship?
Correct.
Think about, seeking to understand, and also making sure that the other party feels heard. And then I think finally, we didn't sort of explain it in this way, but I think what you were just discussing there, John, is around be open to options. So just because you've got a particular position being expressed by someone else doesn't mean that's the only possibility. There's lots of options available, and then getting that support, from trained people that do this day in, day out can definitely help expedite any kind of conflict, particularly if there's been ongoing communication issues for some time. Is that a pretty fair summation there, John?
Sounds a fantastic summary. It's almost like you're a mediator.
Funny you should mention that, John. But great to have you on the podcast, and I hope you can join for some future episodes.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Jan. Take care. Have a good day. Thank you. Bye-bye.